Morning. Now, I thought I might sit down and try and figure something out, because this is something which crops up all the time and it just refuses to die, like Rupert Murdoch. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about that myth which keeps doing the rounds. It's actually split into two bits now. The first is Labour caused all of the economic woes by massively overspending towards the middle to end of their tenure, and the second is that the Conservative Party have irresponsibly spent all of this money again, making the national debt rise up to over 1.7 trillion, and they are somehow more irresponsible than Labour ever were. Let's deal with both of them. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand you over to the wonderful Berry the Cat, a person who's way more experienced at kind of dealing with statistical analysis and graphs and proper thinking. I'm all a little bit kind of interpretive dance and collage, and he responded by saying this. Despite everyone tightening their belts, nursing strikes and benefits being slashed, the national debt is at a record level. So where is all that money going? Before attempting this question, we need to unravel a few straightforward things. First of all, in truth, while the national debt should not be ignored and can be a good measurement for performance overall, it's actually a pretty bad one for judging government spending. The national debt rises because, like most nations, the UK government spends more than it generates. It has a budget deficit. Now, we can all agree that spending more than you can pay is a bad idea in the long run, but to lay the blame for that at the door of the current government is a bit difficult. The last time the UK government had a surplus made more than it spent was in 2002, and it has only had a surplus a total of 8 times in the last 40 years. So a deficit is nothing strange, and secondly, it's also not just because of how much the government spends. To demonstrate the problem, let's compare the fiscal years 2011 and 2012. The 6th of April is our new year for this one. We're in 2018 already. Keep up. In 2011, the government spent around 714 billion and had a budget deficit of about 90 billion. In 2012, the government spent around 720 billion, up 6 billion from 2011, but had a deficit of about 80 billion to add to the national debt. So spending went up year on year, yet the deficit was actually reduced by some 10 billion pounds, a not unsizable disparity of 16 billion. As this chart with the deficit data since 2000 shows, the government has actually successfully reduced the deficit year on year since 2010. Note, 2011 was the first year of the coalition government. The biggest spike is the last year of the Labour government. But before we get too hasty in pointing fingers, negative or positive, let's have a look at another chart. You'd be forgiven for thinking I'd just shown you the same graph, but that's the US equivalent. They look pretty similar, don't they? This is largely because of the other side to the deficit, economic performance. If your economy is strong, your GDP will be higher and you'll collect more tax, so for the same spend your deficit will be lower. You'd be forgiven for thinking the graph looks so similar because the subprime mortgage crisis caused both the US deficit to go high and a meltdown in the UK and recession across the West. But that doesn't explain why the first 7 years also look the same. A lot of economists believe that our economies operate on boom and bust, or business cycles. And while many economists since John Maynard Keynes have proposed ways to try and stabilise it, we've recently seen our latest bust with recession prompted by the collapse of the US subprime mortgage market in 2007. The graph above shows the UK post-World War II deficit patterns. The boom-bust spending pattern caused by the 1958 recession is even visible between 1946 and 1975. When the UK had a consistent net surplus. That's not to say that government doesn't affect deficits or economic performance, but history and all that. So yes, the debt has increased under the Tories, but the deficit they inherited has also significantly decreased in the last few years, and it would be far too simplistic to lay either of these things solely at the door of number 11. In any case, let's have a look at how the government actually spent. Now, if you look at the records, you'll see that government spending has actually increased every year for the period of this graph. So a quick explanation. It is in pounds adjusted for 2017. To compare spending in a fair way, we need to adjust for the fact that as time passes, a steady currency typically loses value through inflation. A pound today is about the same as 73 pence in 2006. There's some really interesting things in this graph. First of all, remember we talked about 2011 and 2012 and how the deficit reduced despite increased spending? You might think this would be a bumper year for the economy, but when we adjust for inflation, we can see that in reality both spending and GDP went down, but GDP went down less, therefore the deficit was reduced. We can also see that with the exception of 2012, which saw a big reduction in real term spending, around 35 billion, the vast majority of the reduction in the deficit seems to be due to the economy picking up and GDP increasing, rather than significantly decreased spending. But we're always being told about cuts, so let's break that spending down a little, adjusted for inflation, naturally. Remember, these numbers are directly comparable, so health spending is roughly the same as it was when the coalition government came in, 2011, in this data. The biggest losers are education and welfare, which have both lost about 20 billion in real terms. This can partly be explained by interest on the national debt increasing by 13 billion in this time, and partly by a 33 billion pound reduction in spending since 2010. It's also worth noting in terms of where's the money gone, that we've seen some exceptional levels of spending on debt interest and welfare since 2010, largely in the early stages of the coalition government. One reason why it feels like we're spending so much more when we're spending about the same as we did in 2009 at least partly boils down to the fact that we are simply not the same nation we were 8 years ago. The population has increased by 3 million and the number of a pensionable age by about the same number again. Between 2011 and 2013, unemployment also reached peak figures of over 8%, slightly higher than in 2010, and yet spending on welfare in this time was significantly reduced overall. When your dependents increase so dramatically and your spending decreases, someone is going to feel the hit. This increasing load can also go some way to explaining why, despite cuts and varying levels of privatisation to the NHS, health spending is still at roughly the same level. So, to answer the question, although the debt has risen under the Tories, spending is now actually comparatively low, about the same as 2009 spending, and the deficit is down. A weak economy has caused problems that we can trace not just in the UK, but almost identically in the US, and it looks likely that it will continue to improve now, almost regardless of any mainstream party government. The bite has been that spending the same amount on an ageing population that has grown by 5% isn't going to deliver the same results. On the flip side, spending more would undoubtedly have resulted in higher national debt. Whether that would have been worth the cost is a political question. So neither the Conservatives or Labour are playing with a straight bat. They're both guilty of oversimplifying a complex economic picture for the sake of scoring political points. It's all about trying to sell you a narrative you can understand, and by trying to convince you an economy works like a personal bank account, they can pull the wool over the eyes of many people. But not me. For I am the cat. Wool is for batting around, not blinding yourself with.